Hi, I'm Dan Robinson with the Great Lakes Spirituality Project, and I'm very happy today to be talking to Rabbi Jonathan Biatch. Welcome, Rabbi.
Thank you. Very good to see you today, Dan.
Thank you. And as we're talking on the fifth day of Hanukkah in December, happy Hanukkah to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Rabbi Biatch has led the Temple Beth community in Madison, Wisconsin for 15 years. Before that, he served Jewish communities across the U.S., including California, Virginia, and Buffalo, New York, along Lake Erie. He has a master's degree in Jewish communal service from Brandeis University and a master's degree in Hebrew letters from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, after which he was ordained a rabbi in 1992. He's also the father of two, and this last little bit I just love. He plays the accordion, so that's fun to read that. Well, thank you, Rabbi, for talking to me today. And I just to start with, at the heart of the Great Lakes Spirituality Project is this connecting our spirituality with care for the ecosystems and the environment in which we live, particularly the Great Lakes. And so, what has been your own journey to connecting your faith and care for the environment?
I think that we begin, at least in our particular faith community, by the command of God to our ancestors, or to the legendary ancestors that we had in our tradition. When God created the world in the second chapter of Genesis, God says that God placed humanity in the garden to, well, the Hebrew words are le'ovda u'leshomra. Sometimes we translate that as to till and to tend, which is a very nice flowery translation. But you could also translate those two words as to serve and preserve it.
Mm.
So if we translate the two words from Hebrew to English as serving and preserving the land, really, the Garden of Eden in that particular context, but it was really the whole earth. That really does say to me, and from a faith-based standpoint, that is our task. And it's very clear that we are, from the stories of creation, we are very much the stewards of this planet. From other parts of our Torah, we understand that God explicitly says that God is the owner of this property and we're only here to take care of it. And if we mess it up, we've messed it up. The implication is we have to take care of it. So even again, from those early parts of the story of creation, we know that we're here to serve and preserve this land. That's one of our primary roles. So that was sort of the beginning of that. I also was looking, at the very opening book of, the very opening chapter of Genesis, and it says there that God first created light, which was very important. We have light, and it's part of the world all around us. But in the second day of creation, God creates the sky in order to separate the upper waters from the lower waters. So somewhere water was there, and water might have even predated some of the acts of creation. And so the primacy of water becomes very apparent even by a simple reading, or casual reading rather, of the first chapter of the book of Genesis as well. So again, the preservation and the connection of us to water, to the care of the earth, is pretty clear from these early creation stories that we read.
Sure. I love that phrase, to serve and preserve. And I'm wondering, I think in terms of working with issues around the Great Lakes, I think people have a real good sense of, or at least they think, there's a lot of shared understanding around the word preserve, or to preserve
Yes.
something. But I'm curious, what do you think is meant by the word serve in that phrase, in terms of serving God's creation?
Well, when I read that word comes to us from a root in Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, which means it means a number of different things. It could mean to work, simple kinds of work. Profession, though, is a different word, but that word means to work. It could also mean, it has the context of, as one is an oved, for example, one is a slave, and that's sometimes how we translate the word slave when we talk about the Israelites who are enslaved to the pharaohs in Egypt. But it also has the sense of worshiping. It also has the sense of the service, if you will, the sacrificial service of the temple in Jerusalem was called avodah, again, from that same root, oved. So it has those three contexts, at least, throughout the scope of the Bible. And it could mean all three. It could mean various different things at different times. The Hebrew language is a very clipped. It's a very it's a language that has fewer terms than we have in English. And so you have to infer a lot when you read Hebrew. You have to sort of imagine what they're talking about.
Sure. Well, and it seems like there'd be sort of the poetic imagination coming into that too, as you go through that, which is nice to think about.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you worked for a time in Buffalo, New York, along Lake Erie near Niagara Falls. Did you feel a connectedness to the Great Lakes then or now? Is that something that sort of entered your consciousness then?
That's a great question. I grew up in Los Angeles, which we were also near the ocean. And in thinking about, my life there's always been some connection to water. When I lived and worked in Virginia for a time, I lived there for 14 years, but I worked for 10 years, but I worked near the Potomac River. I worked near the Potomac River. I worked in Alexandria, lived in the suburban Virginia from the District of Columbia. And there was always a connection with water in my life. I happened to be born under Pisces. So I'm also a water sign. Maybe that there's some connection there as well. But in living on my own in Buffalo, which was the very first time that I really lived by myself, I think that I had an appreciation for the whole of the Lake Erie and the Erie River. I think that's what it's called, the river that connects Lake Erie to Lake Ontario, Niagara Falls, and then Lake Ontario. And a lot of my time was spent in parks along that river, or watching the falls from time to time, going to Toronto on various trips, just observing the beautiful waterfront in that city. I would not take the highway. When I drove from Buffalo to Toronto, it's about an hour and a half drive, but I wouldn't take the highway. I would take the scenic route along the river. And I would take the scenic route along the river and just sort of marvel at it. That a whole area was just replete with important water resources. And so it just showed how important water is to us. Water is everywhere. I have to say, just parenthetically, as a homeowner, homeowners know what happens if you have wrong water in the wrong place at homes. It can be very harmful to you. So you've got to be very respectful of water, even though you can mitigate some damage, but you have to be respectful of the power of water.
Well, that's interesting to me as you tell your story, because I think that's a wide range of experiences of water. Now, I know Los Angeles is near the ocean, but at the same time, my image of that part of Southern California can be pretty dry at times.
Yes.
And then you sort of translate that to, or compare that to where you live now in Madison and Wisconsin, and around lakes and rivers and the Great Lakes in Buffalo. So I guess my question is, those varying experiences of water, what have they taught you about God, I guess, the creator? I know it's kind of an off question, but I just think a lot of us, I have never lived in, I've visited deserts and dry places, but I've never lived in one before. And I think that's an interesting sort of contrast.
I think what it could say about God is that, and this gets into theology, of course, and how one views God, but I think for me, it shows that the wisdom of creation was that there was water here. We know that humanity, we know that mammals, we know that many animals can't exist without water. It's just impossible. And so there must have been some thought, some coordination of creative acts with the understanding of what was to come in the acts of creation, that water needed to be a part of that equation. Because without it, we wouldn't be here.
It sounds like, in a way, the way I hear what you're saying is water is a symbol of God's preparing for life in this world. And
I think that's fair.
For life.
I think that's a fair interpretation. Yes.
Yeah. And
God anticipated this need. Like we build a building, we try to anticipate all the needs possible, and even then we get it wrong a little bit. But I think that God anticipated the need for light and warmth. God anticipated the need for water, because these are the things that ultimately help animal life to grow. And for humanity, it enabled us to achieve and develop and just be part of who we are, who we have become.
A symbol of the Creator's care for us.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Well, um, you've talked a little bit about the Jewish faith's perspective on water. I want to turn that a little bit and ask you about and I mentioned at the top of our conversation that this is in the middle of Hanukkah, and I know that there's a relatively it's not as one of the major festivals during the year, but it's one of them. And are there Jewish celebrations or festivals that take place during the year that particularly address this connection to the environment, this way of celebrating that of God's care for us?
There are the one, in fact, that's coming up quite soon. We'll be observing it on January 24th, but it actually falls on the 27th, if I'm not mistaken, this year at any rate. We have a holiday. The holiday is called Tu BiShvat. Now, the words Tu BiShvat simply translated are the 15th day of the month of Shvat. So first of all, Jewish holidays are observed according to the lunar calendar. And the lunar calendar for us every month begins with a new moon. So by the time we get to the 15th day of the month, it's always the full moon. So we're always celebrating festivals when it's the full moon. And Tu BiShvat, again, simply translated as the 15th day of the month of Shvat. For our ancients, they noted that that is the moment where in the land of Israel, the sap begins to run in the trees again. And trees, that's when really spring sort of begins. So it's about a month or so after the winter solstice. It's about that time when things begin to warm up enough that we see buds on the trees. They're about at the 23rd, latitude. And so it's fairly warm country, as we would know the Middle East to be. And so spring begins then. And in ancient Israel, they used that as a particular date to mark the age of crops. We had to give crops that were a certain number of years old. That's a technicality that's not so important to what we do, but that's why they marked that date. When they saw that sap began to run in the trees, they said, "Oh, this is the next year. This is when the year of the trees begins." And actually, the holiday was sort of put aside for about 1400 or 1500 years. And it originally wasn't even a holiday. It was simply a day that marked this turning point for the trees. But about the year 1600 or so in the land of Israel, that's where our Kabbalistic tradition began. Our mystics sort of formed their own cadre of students and academics and leaders and mentors. And they developed this notion of celebrating that time of year. I mean, it's bad enough that we're stuck inside during the winter rainy season and it's cold and uncomfortable in the land of Israel in the winter and rain. But when spring begins, it begins to get a little bit warm. And it was then that we said, there is such power in the turning of the earth and such power in the gifts of God with more and increased heat and light that this deserves a celebration. And so they took this holiday and began to think about what the implications are. And they took a look at the produce of the land of Israel, which is there are many kinds of different things grown in the land of Israel. And they began to think about how can we celebrate nature. So this has become really in the last 400 years, a major celebration. We talk about different kinds of fruit. We talk about the importance of trees for humanity, not only for their oxygenating of the atmosphere, but also their shade and for many other benefits that trees give us. And it's a time when we celebrate our connections to nature and appreciation of how we have to act in concert with the earth, or the earth will turn on us.
That makes a lot of sense, thinking about that being spring in Israel, but it puts a interesting picture in my mind, at least, of celebrating that here in the Midwest and around the Great Lakes, because it's a very cold time of the year. And yet it's a reminder of that spring is coming, and that the earth will return, in a sense, to sustaining us. And that's a nice sort of thing to happen, I think, at least in the middle of what can be the coldest month of the year.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you can definitely ask the question, why are we here in Madison celebrating the return of spring. And so we're, on the one hand, we're focused originally on the land of Israel, but then we take, once we acknowledge that focus, then we can say, how do we deal with the environment here? And might we not also celebrate what we have here and become more appreciative of what we have here, and how to protect what we have here, again, to serve and preserve what we have here?
Sure. I am not, I confess I'm not familiar with the mystical tradition that you mentioned, and I'm not even gonna attempt the name because I'm gonna make a mistake. But you mentioned around 1600 that this particular mystical tradition in the Jewish faith started this, reinvigorated this celebration.
Hmm.
So do you do you think that there's a connection between sort of this mystical approach to our relationship with the divine and how nature and the environment connects to that? I just find it interesting that it was that part of Judaism that revived that celebration.
Right. I am not a student of the Kabbalah, so I don't know exactly. But as I read, for example, the worship service that they developed and that we change every generation because we want to try and remain relevant, um, Kabbalah looked at a person's soul and how that person turns first inward and then turns their soul outward. So, too, we have to look at our environment from a local perspective, and then how that care and concern affects the broader perspective of the community, the earth, the universe, even, or at least the solar system, but how we turn outward. I mean, that's the way that we in our tradition have taken these words of the mystics and sort of paralleled what we do. We have to look inward first to examine our souls and ourselves and our own relationship to the world, and then how we have broadened that to really look at the whole world and how we bring in everyone to to an appreciation of the environment and appreciation of what nature provides for us.
Sure. I love that image of the turning inward and then turning outward. And I think it's going to connect to my next question. We'll see if I got this right.
Okay.
But, your congregation's mission statement says that the purpose of the congregation is, in part, quote, to bring near the sovereignty of God through acts of Tikkun Olam.
Nice Hebrew, by the way.
Ah,
You
well,
got it right.
uh, well, it's amazing what you can find on the internet. So,
I believe you.
um, so my question is, what is this concept of Tikkun Olam, and how does that connect to caring for creation, that turning outward, and environmental justice?
So Tikkun Olam, we understand to mean the repair of the imperfect world. We believe that when God created the world, whenever that was, that the world needed improvement. That's why we all, humanity, the animal kingdom, the nature, all have to work together in order to bring about more perfection. We have as maybe a sort of a general mission to create a pathway to repair the world. Some people do it exclusively through a relationship with God in our community, but in other communities, other Jewish communities, as well as ours, other people believe that that act of repair has to be initiated through us. We can be inspired by God. We read the Torah, we understand what God sort of expects of us, but we can't rely upon that connection to God to be the sole arbiter of what happens here. We have to be involved. We are God's stewards on this planet. Again, that conception again of our stewardship of this world. And so we have to be prepared in order to make this world a better place through our own actions. And when it comes to the environment, then we have a certain, a subset of ways to work with the environment, whether it's to eliminate fossil fuels and to reduce the amount of coal that is introduced into the environment, and to worry about lake and what happens with pesticide and waste runoff from farms, and why we need to be involved in finding renewable sources of energy that really can sustain us for the next 50 to 75 years, why we have to be concerned about re-entering the climate accords. Thankfully, the new administration will take us in that direction, God willing. And so, we have to really find ways of acting in every possible arena to help make the world better. Now, the concept of repair, by the way, applies to a lot of different areas, but we're talking specifically about water, and about the environment. So I'm going to
Sure.
stay there.
Yeah,
for a
yeah,
second.
sure. Um, that's great. I appreciate that explanation. That really clarifies it. And I'm wondering, in the life of the Temple Bethel community, are there things that your community is doing along those lines in terms of repairing or the environment or working towards that betterment?
Actually, in our community, it's sort of an undercurrent of all that we do.
Mm,
We find ways to make sure that we preserve water. We find ways to encourage our people to preserve water. We find ways to try and not use too many disposable products. Religious communities have ancient sets of china that we sometimes use in place of paper. Sometimes we find that we find new ways of paper that's compostable. We try to be very careful in what we do, and we try to advocate to our people that these are ways you may want to consider in terms of helping our local environment.
okay.
To be very honest, sometimes we have other priorities that sneak in. I mean, these days we're talking about racial justice, so we could be better in what we do. But I think that this is sort of an undercurrent again of everything that goes on here.
Well, I think we all would agree there's no lack of things to do to help repair the world. And so we do what we can, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This may be a bit of a stretch of a question, but I'm just wondering if you were to sort of guess at what Judaism, your tradition, might say about a spirituality of the Great Lakes. Do you think there
Mhm.
would be a perspective to that?
I think that there would have to be. And I think that we would want to really start with something nearby, meaning the following. We have a building where our building is situated. It's half a block from Lake Wingra. And it's been here ever since. I think this was the very first place that our synagogue building existed.
Mm,
Um, this building was first established in 1950, and it's been renovated a number of times. At some point, the community talked about moving out to West Madison somewhere or Middleton, and the decision was no, we're going to remain here. We're going to remain close to our heritage. We're going to remain close to this lake. We're going to remain close to downtown where there are other lakes to deal with. Not that the lake, not the proximity of downtown, meaning Mendota and Monona, those two lakes there, but simply we have a lake here that allows us to appreciate the water. We have an arboretum that's right across the street from where our synagogue is located, and we appreciate the all that nature accords us here. So, we start from the premise of where we are near water, and isn't that an important part of what we need to be doing? Um, we've just begun to consider what it means to be part or to have our synagogue on the land of the Ho-Chunk Nation.
mm,
Because that's the people who settled here first. These indigenous peoples, these First Nations, really knew a lot more about water than we might, modern day, 21st century Americans. And so we have to begin to take more of an appreciation of what they can teach us in terms of how they might have approached living in the proximity of all this water. And so that's another important bit of learning that we're in the middle of right now.
sure. Well, what I love about that answer, and I've written about this, and I've had other conversations with folks about this in terms of a spirituality of the Great Lakes, is it's sort of one of those key components of that is a commitment to place
Mm.
that 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 says who we are and how we connect with the wider world in a greater reality is impacted and is important because of the place we find ourselves and that sense of transience. Not that there aren't things to discover about the divine in that experience too, but there's something about a commitment to place that makes a difference. And so I really hear that in what you're saying, and that certainly is a piece of how we've been working with this project so far.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Well, I really appreciate you making the time to talk today, Rabbi. This has been a great conversation, and just really grateful for the time.
It's my pleasure, Dan. Anytime. Give me a call back if you need more, or if you need follow up. I'm more than happy to offer that.
All right. Well, thank you very much.